The prescription pad hit my desk with a sharp slap. I looked up from the medical chart I was reviewing to find Derek Hartman glaring at me, his face red with anger. "Write it," he demanded, tapping the blank pad with his finger. 50 milligrams, twice daily. I know what I need. I'd been a nurse practitioner for 12 years and I'd seen plenty of difficult patients, but Derek was something else entirely. He wasn't just demanding. He was entitled, aggressive, and completely convinced that his money and connections meant the rules didn't apply to him. "Mr. Hartman," I said calmly, closing the chart. "We've discussed this. Your test results don't support that prescription. The medication you're asking for isn't appropriate for your condition." His eyes narrowed. "Do you know who I am? I sit on the hospital board. One phone call and you're finished here." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "Write the prescription, or I'll make sure you never work in this city again." I smiled, a small, practiced smile that gave nothing away. "I understand you're frustrated. Let me review your file again." What Derek didn't know was that I'd been documenting everything for 3 months. It started in January, during Derek's first appointment at Riverside Medical Center. I was filling in for Dr. Patterson, who was on maternity leave. The clinic specialized in pain management, and Derek had been referred by his primary physician for chronic back pain. From the moment he walked in, something felt off. His medical history listed a car accident 2 years ago, but when I asked about his symptoms, his answers were vague and inconsistent. He couldn't pinpoint when the pain started or what made it worse. Then he asked for oxycodone by name, specific dosage, specific quantity. When I explained that we needed to start with less aggressive options and proper diagnostic testing, his entire demeanor changed. "I don't have time for games," he'd said, his tone shifting from friendly to cold. "My last doctor understood what I needed. Just write the prescription." I'd politely declined and ordered an MRI instead. He left angry, but he came back 2 weeks later. The MRI showed minor degenerative changes, nothing that warranted the strong narcotics he was requesting. I recommended physical therapy and anti-inflammatory medication. That's when he made his first threat. "My wife's family owns half the real estate in this county," Derek had said during that second visit, "including the building this clinic leases. It would be a shame if your employer had to relocate because of lease issues." Most people would have been intimidated. I was careful. I documented the conversation in his medical record, noting his exact words and the time. I also started keeping a personal log, separate from the official records, detailing every interaction. By March, Derek had seen me 6 times. Each visit followed the same pattern. He'd complain about pain, request specific narcotics, and when I refused, he'd make thinly veiled threats. He mentioned knowing the hospital administrator. He talked about his connections to local politicians. He even implied he could file complaints that would trigger investigations into my practice. But what Derek didn't realize was that I'd worked in pain management long enough to recognize prescription shopping. I'd also worked in enough hospitals to know how to protect myself. Every conversation was documented. Every threat was recorded in writing. Every refusal to prescribe was backed by medical evidence and proper protocol. I wasn't just covering myself. I was building a case. The prescription pad incident happened on a Tuesday morning in late March. Derek had scheduled a routine follow-up, but within minutes, it became clear this wasn't about medical care. It was about control. After his threat about ending my career, I calmly pulled up his electronic medical record on my computer. "Mr. Hartman, I see you've visited 4 different providers in the past 6 months, 2 emergency rooms, 1 urgent care clinic, and now our pain management center. Each time, you've requested the same medication." His face went pale for just a second before anger replaced the shock. "That's none of your business. Different injuries, different needs." "Actually," I said, keeping my voice professional, "the state prescription monitoring program flags patterns like this. It's designed to prevent medication misuse. I'm required by law to check this database before prescribing controlled substances." Derek stood up abruptly, knocking his chair backward. "You have no right to access my private medical information from other facilities." I met his gaze steadily. "I have every right. It's part of my due diligence as a prescriber, and based on what I'm seeing, I cannot in good conscience write you this prescription." That's when Derek made his biggest mistake. He pulled out his phone and made a call right there in my office. "Gerald? Derek Hartman. I need you to do something for me. That nurse practitioner I mentioned? The one causing problems? I want her employment reviewed. Today." He was calling Gerald Whitmore, the hospital's chief operating officer. I knew Gerald from hospital committees. He was a good administrator, but he was also politically minded and careful about relationships with board members. Derek hung up and smiled. "You have until end of business today, then you're done." He walked out, leaving my office door wide open. I sat there for a moment, then reached for my phone. I didn't call my supervisor or the medical director. Instead, I called someone Derek had probably forgotten about. Patricia Cole, the hospital's compliance officer. Patricia and I had worked together 3 years ago when another provider was caught in a prescription fraud scheme. She knew I was thorough and honest. More importantly, she knew how to handle situations exactly like this. "Patricia," I said when she answered, "I need to file a formal report about a patient making threats related to prescription requests. Can you come to my office?" Patricia arrived within 20 minutes, carrying her laptop and a legal pad. She was a short woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. She'd been in healthcare compliance for 30 years and had seen every scheme, threat, and manipulation tactic imaginable. I walked her through everything. The 6 visits, the escalating demands, the threats, the multiple providers he'd seen. I showed her my documentation, including the notes from today's confrontation and Derek's phone call to Gerald. She listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes. When I finished, she sat back and folded her arms. "You did everything right. Every single thing. Your documentation is textbook perfect." "Derek called Gerald," I said. "He's going to push for my termination." Patricia's mouth curved into a small smile. "Let him try. What Mr. Hartman doesn't understand is that threatening a healthcare provider over prescription refusal is a serious matter. It's not just an HR issue, it's potentially a legal one." She opened her laptop and pulled up several documents. "I'm going to need copies of everything you showed me. Then I'm going to brief the medical director and our legal counsel. If Gerald gets a call from Derek, he'll already know the full story." By noon, the situation had escalated exactly as I expected. Gerald called me to his office. When I arrived, he was sitting behind his desk with a tight expression. Standing beside him was Bryce Montgomery, the hospital's legal counsel. "Come in," Gerald said, gesturing to a chair. His tone was formal, careful. "I received a call this morning from Derek Hartman. He's made some serious allegations about your patient care and professionalism." I sat down and placed my folder on my lap. "I'm aware. He called you from my office after I refused to write a prescription that wasn't medically appropriate." Bryce leaned forward. "Walk us through what happened." "Everything." I did. I explained Derek's pattern of visits, his specific requests for controlled substances, the threats he'd made, and the prescription monitoring data that showed he was seeing multiple providers. I provided copies of my documentation, which I'd prepared before coming to the meeting. Gerald's expression shifted from concern to focused as he read through the notes. Bryce took his time reviewing each document, occasionally asking clarifying questions. Finally, he set the papers down and looked at Gerald. "This isn't a personnel issue," Bryce said. "This is a patient attempting to manipulate a provider into inappropriate prescribing through intimidation." Gerald sighed and rubbed his temples. "Derek sits on our board. His family has significant influence in the community. This is going to be complicated." "No," Bryce said firmly. "It's actually quite simple. We support our medical staff when they follow proper protocols. If we don't, we expose the hospital to liability, and we send a message that intimidation works." I spoke up. "Derek mentioned his wife's family owns the building we lease. He implied they could create problems for the clinic." Gerald's face darkened. "He said that?" "It's documented in my notes from his second visit, February 15th, 2:30 in the afternoon." Bryce made a note. "That's potentially coercive behavior. Depending on how this develops, it could become a matter for the state medical board or even law enforcement." There was a long silence. Finally, Gerald looked at me. "You're not being terminated. You're not even being investigated. You followed protocol perfectly. I want you to know that." Relief washed over me, but I kept my expression neutral. Thank you. However, Gerald continued, we need to handle this carefully. Derek will escalate. I need you to avoid any contact with him outside official medical channels. Document everything, report anything unusual, and let us handle the politics. That evening, I met my colleague, Vanessa Brooks, at a coffee shop near the hospital. Vanessa was a physician assistant who'd worked in pain management even longer than I had. She'd seen her share of difficult patients and understood the pressure that came with prescription requests. Derek Hartman? She said, stirring sugar into her coffee. I've heard stories about him. He tried the same thing with a provider at Northside Clinic last year. They ended up banning him from the practice. Did they report it? I don't think so. They just wanted him gone. She paused. Be careful. Men like Derek don't like being told no, and when they have money and connections, they don't stop easily. I already knew that. What worried me wasn't Derek's connections or his threats. It was what he might do if he felt cornered. People who are used to getting their way don't handle rejection well, and Derek struck me as someone who would burn everything down rather than accept defeat. Over the next week, I heard nothing from Derek. No appointment requests, no phone calls, no messages. The silence felt ominous. Then Patricia called me. Derek filed a formal complaint with the state medical board, Patricia said without preamble. He's alleging that you refused appropriate medical care based on personal bias, and that you violated patient privacy by accessing his records from other facilities. My stomach dropped. A medical board complaint was serious. Even if it was ultimately dismissed, it would be on my record and could trigger an investigation that lasted months. When did he file? 3 days ago. The board notified us this morning as a courtesy. She paused. Here's the thing. His complaint is full of inaccuracies. He claims you never performed an examination, never ordered diagnostic tests, and made comments about his character, all of which we can disprove with your documentation. So what happens now? You'll need to submit a formal response. I'm already working with Bryce to prepare it. We'll include copies of your notes, the prescription monitoring data, and evidence of his threatening behavior. The board will review everything and make a determination. I felt a mix of anger and vindication. Derek had just made another mistake. By filing a false complaint, he'd created an official record of his behavior. Every threat, every demand, every manipulation was now going to be scrutinized by state regulators. There's more, Patricia added. Bryce wants to file a counter-complaint against Derek for patient misconduct and attempted coercion of a healthcare provider. The hospital's response was swift and thorough. Within a week, Bryce had prepared a comprehensive filing with the state medical board, outlining Derek's pattern of behavior. It included testimony from the other providers he'd seen, prescription monitoring data showing his attempts to obtain narcotics from multiple sources, and documented evidence of his threats. But Derek wasn't backing down. 2 weeks after his initial complaint, I received a letter from his attorney. It was a formal notice of intent to sue me personally for negligence and emotional distress, claiming my refusal to prescribe medication had caused him unnecessary suffering. I read the letter 3 times, feeling anger build with each pass. The allegations were absurd. I'd never denied him treatment. I'd offered multiple alternatives, including physical therapy, non-narcotic medications, and referrals to specialists. What I'd refused was to prescribe a specific narcotic based on his demands rather than medical necessity. I called Bryce immediately. I just got a letter from Derek's attorney. I got one too, Bryce said calmly. So did Gerald and the hospital. It's an intimidation tactic. He's trying to pressure you into backing down before the medical board reviews his complaint. What do I do? Nothing. Don't respond. Don't contact him. Don't engage. Let me handle this. But Derek wasn't done. 2 days after the legal letters, I arrived at work to find my supervisor, Claudia Torres, waiting in my office. Her expression was troubled. We have a problem, she said, closing the door. Derek's wife, Natalie Hartman, called the clinic this morning. She's threatening to organize a protest outside the hospital, claiming we're denying patients proper pain management. I stared at her. A protest? She's connected to several community organizations through her family's charitable foundation. She's telling people that you're part of a systemic problem in healthcare, that providers are so afraid of prescribing pain medication that patients are suffering unnecessarily. It was brilliant, in a twisted way. Derek was reframing his personal vendetta as a social justice issue. He was trying to turn public opinion against me while hiding his own manipulative behavior. "What does Gerald want me to do?" Claudia sat down. "He wants you to keep your head down and let the legal and compliance teams handle it. But between us, I think you should prepare for this to get worse before it gets better." She was right. By the end of the week, local news outlets had picked up the story. The coverage was vague but damaging, talking about concerns over pain management practices at Riverside Medical Center without mentioning Derek's name or the real circumstances. The publicity campaign forced the hospital to respond publicly. Gerald issued a statement defending the clinic's practices and emphasizing the hospital's commitment to appropriate evidence-based care. But the damage was done. Patients started asking questions. Staff morale dropped. I could feel colleagues watching me differently, wondering if the rumors they'd heard were true. Through it all, I kept working. I saw patients, documented everything carefully, and followed every protocol exactly as I'd been trained. I refused to let Derek's tactics change how I practiced medicine. Then Patricia called with news that changed everything. "The state medical board reviewed Derek's complaint," she said. "They dismissed it entirely. Not only that, they flagged his file for investigation based on the evidence we provided about his prescription shopping." What does that mean? It means they're looking into whether Derek has been engaging in prescription fraud. If they find sufficient evidence, they could refer the case to law enforcement. And there's more. Remember that prescription monitoring data? I sent copies to the other facilities he visited. 2 of them have filed their own complaints about his behavior. For the first time in weeks, I felt something like hope. Derek had overplayed his hand. His attempt to destroy my career had instead triggered investigations into his own conduct. But Derek wasn't finished. When the medical board dismissed his complaint, he escalated again. His attorney filed a lawsuit in civil court, formally suing me and the hospital for negligence, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The lawsuit made Derek's claims public record. It was full of dramatic language about suffering and indifference, painting me as a cruel provider who refused to help a patient in pain. It claimed damages of $500,000. Reading the lawsuit felt surreal. Every allegation was either false or twisted beyond recognition. Where I'd offered alternative treatments, the lawsuit claimed I'd offered nothing. Where I'd followed medical protocols, the lawsuit claimed I'd acted arbitrarily. Where I'd documented his threats, the lawsuit claimed I'd fabricated evidence to cover my own misconduct. Bryce assured me the case was weak and would likely be dismissed, but it didn't matter. The lawsuit was public. Derek's goal wasn't to win in court. It was to destroy my reputation and force the hospital to settle just to make the problem go away. I spent that night staring at my ceiling, wondering if 12 years of careful, ethical practice were about to be destroyed by one manipulative patient who couldn't handle being told no. The next morning, something unexpected happened. A woman named Alicia Porter called the clinic and asked to speak with me directly. She identified herself as an investigator with the state medical board. "I'm calling about Derek Hartman," she said. "We've been reviewing the complaints filed regarding his conduct with multiple providers. Your documentation has been particularly helpful. I wanted to let you know that we're opening a formal investigation." "Into Derek?" "Yes. We have evidence suggesting he's been engaged in a pattern of prescription fraud and provider intimidation across multiple facilities. We're also coordinating with local law enforcement because some of his behavior may constitute criminal conduct." She paused. "I can't share details of an ongoing investigation, but I wanted you to know that your complaint was the catalyst. Your documentation was thorough enough that we could build a timeline of his activities. Other providers came forward after seeing that we were taking this seriously." After we hung up, I sat at my desk feeling something between vindication and exhaustion. I'd done everything right, but it had cost me weeks of stress, damaged my reputation, and put my career at risk. Even if Derek faced consequences, the damage he'd done to me wasn't going to disappear overnight. But at least the truth was coming out. The lawsuit proceeded slowly through the legal system. Bryce filed a motion to dismiss, arguing that the claims were frivolous and unsupported by evidence. Derek's attorney fought back, but their responses were weak and contradictory. Meanwhile, the state investigation into Derek continued quietly in the background. I didn't hear much about it directly, but Patricia kept me updated when she could. Investigators had interviewed multiple providers, reviewed prescription monitoring data from across the state, and documented a pattern of behavior spanning more than 3 years. In May, 2 months after Derek's initial threat in my office, something shifted. Gerald called me to his office again, but this time, his demeanor was completely different. Derek has withdrawn his lawsuit, Gerald said, handing me a document. His attorney filed a notice of voluntary dismissal this morning. No settlement, no conditions, just a complete withdrawal. I read the legal filing, hardly believing it. Why? I can't say for certain, but I have a theory. I think his attorney realized how bad this looked. The more discovery we conducted, the more evidence we uncovered of Derek's behavior. His lawyer probably advised him to cut his losses before things got worse. Bryce, who was also in the meeting, added, "There's also the state investigation. Derek's attorney would know about that. Pursuing a civil lawsuit while under criminal investigation is generally a bad strategy." With the lawsuit dismissed, the pressure eased. The news coverage faded. Patients stopped asking questions. Life at the clinic slowly returned to normal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't really over. I was right. In June, the state medical board issued a formal finding against Derek. They determined he had engaged in prescription fraud by misrepresenting his medical condition to multiple providers in order to obtain controlled substances. They referred the case to the county prosecutor's office for potential criminal charges. Patricia forwarded me the board's report. Reading it felt like validation. Every detail I'd documented, every threat I'd noted, every refusal I'd justified with medical evidence had contributed to a comprehensive picture of Derek's behavior. The report concluded with a recommendation that Derek be flagged in the state prescription monitoring system as a high-risk patient requiring additional scrutiny. Any provider who attempted to prescribe controlled substances to him in the future would receive an automatic alert. But the most satisfying part came 2 paragraphs from the end. The board commends nurse practitioner Riley Carson for her ethical conduct and thorough documentation throughout this matter. Her actions exemplify appropriate professional standards and likely prevented patient harm. My name was in a state document praising my conduct. After months of stress and uncertainty, that simple acknowledgement meant everything. In July, Derek was formally charged with prescription fraud and filing false reports. The charges were serious, potentially carrying jail time and substantial fines. His attorney negotiated a plea deal. Derek would plead guilty to reduced charges, enter a drug treatment program, and accept permanent flagging in the prescription monitoring system. The deal also included something unusual. Derek was required to send formal apology letters to every provider he'd threatened or manipulated. I received mine on a Tuesday afternoon. The letter was short and clearly written by his attorney rather than Derek himself. It acknowledged his inappropriate behavior, expressed regret for the stress he'd caused, and stated he was seeking help for substance abuse issues. It was clinical and impersonal, but it was something. I filed the letter with all my other documentation. The case was effectively closed. Derek had faced consequences. My reputation was intact. The hospital had supported me. Everything had worked out as well as it could have. But I couldn't help thinking about how close things had come to going the other way. If I hadn't documented everything, if Patricia hadn't moved quickly, if Bryce hadn't been willing to fight back, Derek might have succeeded. I might have lost my license, my career, everything I'd worked for. That summer, I was invited to speak at a state nursing conference about prescription management and dealing with difficult patients. The organizers had heard about the Derek situation through professional networks and wanted me to share what I'd learned. I almost declined. The experience had been traumatic, and I wasn't sure I wanted to relive it publicly. But Claudia encouraged me. "Other providers need to hear this," she said. "You did everything right, and you survived. That's a message people need. So I agreed. In August, I stood in front of 200 healthcare providers and told them Derek's story. I explained the warning signs I'd noticed, the documentation I'd maintained, the support systems I'd used. I talked about the importance of following protocols even when pressured, trusting your clinical judgment, and building relationships with compliance and legal staff before problems arose. The response was overwhelming. During the question period, multiple providers shared their own experiences with manipulative patients. Some had given in to pressure and regretted it. Others had stood firm but felt isolated and unsupported. Several thanked me for speaking openly about something many people experienced but rarely discussed. After the conference, I received dozens of emails from attendees. Many shared their own stories. Some asked for advice about current situations. A few simply thanked me for validating their experiences and giving them courage to stand firm when facing similar pressure. In September, 6 months after Derek's threat in my office, I received a promotion. Gerald offered me a position as the clinic's lead practitioner for pain management, with additional responsibilities for provider education and protocol development. "You've proven yourself under the worst possible circumstances," Gerald said during the offer meeting. "You maintained your ethical standards, protected patient safety, and handled an extremely difficult situation with professionalism. Those are exactly the qualities we need in leadership." I accepted. The new role came with more responsibility and a better salary. But more importantly, it gave me the opportunity to help other providers avoid situations like the one I'd faced with Derek. One of my first initiatives was developing a comprehensive training program on identifying and responding to prescription shopping and provider intimidation. I worked with Patricia and Bryce to create clear protocols, documentation templates, and escalation procedures. We rolled out the training to every provider in the hospital system. The feedback was immediate and positive. Providers felt more confident knowing exactly what to do when faced with inappropriate prescription requests or threats. Compliance and legal staff appreciated having standardized procedures. Administration valued the reduced liability risk. But the most meaningful feedback came from individual providers who reached out privately to thank me. They shared stories of situations where the training had helped them stand firm, document appropriately, and seek support when needed. By October, I'd largely moved past the Derek situation. It was part of my history now, a difficult experience that had ultimately made me stronger and more effective in my role. I rarely thought about him anymore. Then I got a call from Alicia Porter, the state investigator. "I wanted to give you an update," she said. "Derek completed his treatment program. As part of his plea agreement, he's required to maintain ongoing counseling and regular drug testing for 3 years. If he complies, the charges will eventually be reduced to misdemeanors." "How's he doing?" According to his counselor, he's made progress. He's acknowledged he had a problem and that his behavior toward providers was inappropriate. Whether that's genuine insight or just compliance with the program, I can't say. She paused. "The reason I'm calling is that Derek's case has become something of a precedent in this state. Prosecutors and medical boards are using it as an example of how to handle provider intimidation cases. Your documentation and the hospital's response set a standard for how these situations should be managed." After we hung up, I sat with that information. Derek's attempt to destroy my career had inadvertently created better protections for other providers. His threats had led to clearer protocols, stronger support systems, and increased awareness of prescription fraud patterns. In trying to manipulate the system, he'd actually made it stronger. As fall turned to winter, I settled fully into my new role. I was teaching, mentoring newer providers, and helping develop policies that would protect both patients and staff. The work was fulfilling in ways my previous position hadn't been. One afternoon in November, I was reviewing training materials when Vanessa stopped by my office. "Remember when we had coffee back in March?" she asked. "When you first told me about Derek?" "I remember. You warned me to be careful. I was worried for you. Men like Derek usually get away with it because people are afraid to fight back. But you didn't back down. And now look at what you've built from it." She gestured at the materials on my desk. You turned a bad situation into something that's helping dozens of providers across the state. That's impressive." Her words stayed with me. She was right. I could have responded to Derek's threats differently. I could have given in, written the prescription, avoided the conflict. Or I could have fought back emotionally, let anger drive my decisions, made mistakes that would have undermined my position. Instead, I'd stayed calm, documented everything, trusted the system, and relied on people who knew how to navigate these situations. That approach had protected me and ultimately led to broader change. In December, almost a year after Derek's first appointment, I attended a hospital board meeting to present our new provider protection protocols. It was my first time presenting to the board, and I was nervous. The presentation went well. Board members asked thoughtful questions about implementation, cost, and effectiveness. They seemed genuinely impressed by the comprehensive approach we'd developed. At the end, the board chair thanked me for my work and commitment to patient safety. As I packed up my materials, I noticed the empty seat where Derek used to sit. He'd resigned from the board in June as part of his plea agreement. His absence was a quiet reminder of how much had changed in 12 months. Walking back to my office, I thought about the person I'd been a year ago. I'd been confident in my clinical skills, but naive about how far some people would go to get what they wanted. I'd understood protocols intellectually, but hadn't fully appreciated their importance as protection. The experience with Derek had taught me that doing the right thing wasn't always enough. You also had to document it, build alliances, understand the systems around you, and be willing to fight when necessary. Those lessons had made me a better provider and a better leader. By January, 1 year after Derek's first appointment, I'd trained over 300 providers across 5 hospitals in the healthcare system. The training program had been so successful that other hospital systems in the state were asking to license our materials. Patricia and I worked together to create a standardized version that could be used more broadly. We included real case examples, practical documentation templates, and clear decision trees for handling difficult situations. We were careful to anonymize Derek's case, but his situation informed much of the content. One evening, while reviewing feedback surveys from recent training sessions, I came across a comment that made me stop. This training gave me permission to trust my clinical judgment and say no when something doesn't feel right. I've been practicing for 15 years, and I've never felt more confident handling difficult patients. Thank you. That comment captured exactly what I'd hoped to achieve. The system had supported me when I needed it, and now I was paying that forward by helping other providers feel confident standing their ground when faced with inappropriate pressure. The work wasn't glamorous or dramatic. It was documentation templates and policy revisions and training presentations. But it was important, and it made a difference. This morning, I met with a new nurse practitioner who's joining our pain management clinic. Her name is Simone, and she's nervous about handling controlled substance prescriptions and difficult patients. I remembered feeling the same way years ago. I walked her through our protocols, showed her the documentation system, and introduced her to Patricia and Bryce. I told her about the support systems available and emphasized that she should never feel alone when facing a difficult situation. Then I told her Derek's story, not to scare her but to show her that the system works when you follow it. That documentation matters. That standing firm on medical ethics isn't just allowed, it's expected and supported. "What if someone threatens me?" she asked. "What if they have connections or money or power?" I smiled, remembering Derek's face when he'd slapped that prescription pad on my desk, so certain he would win. Then you document everything, you follow protocols exactly, and you trust that doing the right thing will protect you, because it will. She looked relieved. "Thank you." I needed to hear that. As she left my office, I thought about how far I'd come from that March morning when Derek tried to intimidate me into inappropriate prescribing. He'd thought his connections and threats would break me. Instead, they'd revealed exactly who I was. Someone who wouldn't compromise patient safety, no matter the pressure. Derek had pushed, thinking he could control me. What he learned was that control doesn't come from threats or connections. It comes from doing your job with integrity, trusting the system, and refusing to back down when you know you're right. That's who was really in control all along.